they've announced the PS5 VR,
Oh, I didn't see that. No.
like
Okay.
the
When does it
pricing
come out?
and stuff. Sometime I think February 2023. I think, but the pricing and stuff is out. It's pretty expensive. It's like $800.
That's kind of what I
That's not
expected.
including the actual PlayStation, right? That's just
Yeah,
No.
no, it's just
yeah,
it's more expensive than the console.
Yeah, I was
VR.
expecting that.
yeah, definitely well worth checking
VR is
out.
so pricey when you look into it, I've
Uh,
found. But
Although the thing that I'm really waiting on is I don't know if it's been announced, but when I saw it, it hadn't been mentioned whether or not it's computer compatible, PC compatible. Because
Yeah,
it'd be like
yeah, it'd be a really smart move by them to do that.
they are.
that'd
Sony
make
is
it like
definitely
just
moving towards working with, like, bringing their games and whatnot to PC. So I could actually see that happening.
that'd make it like the by far the most attractive VR.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right, well, we are live. So today we are going to talk about the number one best economy in the whole world, China. I don't know if you ever look up this stuff on YouTube, but
You mispronounced Taiwan.
West Taiwan specifically.
yeah, I'm gonna get our channel shut down.
Well, no, China's number two economy. Taiwan's number one. Easy.
They're the same country. It's fine. Yeah, like if you look up this topic on YouTube or it crops up in the news quite a bit, there's a lot of talk of China being on the verge of economic collapse. So we wanted to take a look at this and see what's going on, especially now that Z has consolidated power. So it makes it rather topical as well. So I think the first thing that we'll do is kind of launch into just how China got to be the second biggest economy, and if you believe some people, now the largest economy in the world. Hubbard, do you want to take us through a quick recap of that?
Well, I guess the conventional story is more or less accurate, which is they cozied up to the U.S. starting in like the 1980s, and the U.S. was happy enough to, I guess, give them the go ahead on like trade. The U.S. kind of, as far as I understand it, wanted like a counterbalance to the USSR at that point. Wanted to see if they could drag China away from that sphere of influence. So they decided to set up trade, and then China just utilized their comparative advantage in cheap labor and just manufactured the ever living shit out of everything and exported it to the US, and essentially pulled like a Japan a couple decades later than Japan, and grew, at high single digits or low double digits for 30 years. And I mean, the end result of that is they went from like a couple hundred billion-dollar a year economy to a multi-trillion dollar economy. And so if you put it in like per capita GDP, it's like around 500 or less per capita GDP prior to their rapid growth, and then post they're well over $10,000 USD per capita GDP. And obviously that has, like that, those are just numbers, but like you can go look at any metric of wealth and prosperity, and it's just unprecedented in human history in terms of like how much wealth and prosperity they've accumulated in such a short period of time.
And
And
even how widely it's spread out. Like a lot of people do kind of forget the fact that so many poor rural farmers moved to cities and became effectively middle class citizens in the world from nothing.
yeah, and that if you go and look at even like the UN collects data on poverty levels, right? And over the last 30, 40 years, poverty levels in the world overall have declined like quite a bit. And a huge chunk of that is just China. Like obviously, like it's, the numbers are disputed based on, what you count and all that. But I think there's no question it was hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Like that's just undisputable that it's hundreds of millions. How many hundreds of millions you can
Quibble
argue
about at
about?
the edges.
Yeah, but it's like the single biggest, reduction in human poverty and human suffering in the world's history. So it is very impressive. And I guess the reason that we're taking a closer look at everything is, I think the narrative coming out of, the, I don't know what you call, like the 2000s or early 2010s was like China's economic dominance was just like set to continue. There was like,
Hmm.
go look back at that era, and there's like 30 books about like the Asian century and like China, the Chinese century, and like how China was just going to continue uninterrupted to grow and grow and grow at these spectacular rates until they surpassed the United States, and far surpassed the United States on both a absolute level, and I think there was a lot of predictions that they would even pass the United States in terms of per capita income and wealth at, eventually.
Yeah.
And further, I think baked into the expectations of this continued growth and continued prosperity was a assumption about how it was all precipitated, which was that the CCP, you know, from a centralized planning position, uh, did these, 5-year plans, and they, organized these huge investments in infrastructure and economic projects, blah blah blah, and the CCP just through their meritocratic and highly efficient system, precipitated all this growth, and that they would, they were unique in the way that they operated as a political entity, and in fact, for economic growth, they were far superior to, say, Western democracies, and that therefore they would be able to sustain this growth for much longer than the conventional economy, because they, could, with agility and ease, overcome any obstacle that came up in terms of hindering their growth, and just, work around it and come up with solutions that a, democracy laden with, infighting and
Partisan politics.
yeah, partisan politics would just fail to do. And I guess the kind of the last part of the equation there was like, the CCP will accomplish this goal of, being the number one economy and growing just past the United States and their allies. And Western people shouldn't worry about it. Like this was like a lot of the thinking in Western circles is like, that sounds scary, but it's not scary, because as we all know, economic growth always results in political freedom, and therefore by the time China, takes the mantle as the biggest economy in the world, they'll have liberalized tremendously, and they'll be, basically a much
Another
softer,
democracy.
yeah, much softer and friendlier country, and well on their way to, a modern democracy, and it's all good, because they'll basically be where we want them to be, in terms of human rights and all this stuff. And so it's great. They'll be the number one economy, but they'll be they'll be a gentle giant that will.
I know in the neoliberal economist circles, they would often say things like, you can't have political freedom without economic freedom. And then this is the logical inversion of that people ran with, that, well, if you can't have political freedom without economic freedom, then if you have lots of economic freedom to make money, then you must have political freedom. There's no way you could possibly repress someone who's making money. That seemed to be what people were thinking at the time.
Yeah, it was. I mean, a lot of these things are impossible to test, right? So it was a lot of correlation equals causation thinking, where you look around the world and you do notice that the countries that have a lot of political freedom also have a lot of economic freedom, and therefore they must be just linked to each other in a tight relationship, and you can't have one without the other, so they'll just move along merrily together no matter what the situation. I think that was a lot of the thinking. It's just It just, and there's no experiment you can run that will, bear fruit on whether or not that's true, right? So I think that, yeah, there is a bit of a problem with like empiricism around these issues, because there's never going to be a test that you can run to confirm or deny any of these theories. So in these cases, if these like popular theories kind of take hold, then there's not really anything you can do except for let the natural experiment of the country doing its thing run its course and see what happens, right? Like there's no advanced research you're going to be able to pull out and say, oh, no, see, this doesn't actually hold.
See, this was a net negative for the global community to pursue this line of dealing with China.
Yeah, so it is a bit unfortunate in that regard, where there's just not a lot of research or scientific method that can be applied to determine if the hopeful theorizing actually is rooted in reality. And I guess that's kind of where we are, right? Is I think we're at like the time of the century where a lot of these theories are the rubber's meeting the road, and we're seeing whether or not they're coming true in real time. And I think COVID, right, brought in an acceleration, if anything. Like it was like a pressure cooker test of just like, how, is this actually going to work out, and how is it going to work out? And so I think that's kind of what we're going to plan to address here, is what's happening in China, and what do we think is going to happen, given the conventional narrative.
I think if we want to keep talking a little bit about that theory of political freedom and the economic freedom and how people see it right now, I think it does look like people are still thinking that there is that correlation there, in a sense, but that basically China has decided that they're going to start restricting the economic freedom more than they have been in order to maintain their lack of political freedom. Like there does seem to be some worry about the future for investment into China right now that wasn't there even pre-COVID, really. COVID seemed to have been the big inflection point for seeing what the government could actually do in China.
Yeah, that is something that like when I was doing some of the research, I was looking at some investors talking about it, and that was one of the things mentioned, where they realized just how draconian and uncaring and uncompromising the government is. And you would have thought that they would have kind of seen that before, or at least the possibility. But COVID definitely, like the lockdowns really did show, I think anybody who was paying attention to China at all, just I guess like how much control the Chinese government really does have, and how willing they are to decimate their own economy in terms of saving face and doing what they think is best in terms of national security. Like it's when push comes to shove, like the government steps in and has complete control, basically. Like there's no sort of leeway, there's no wiggle room. If the CCP wants, it's going to happen, in terms of like if it comes down to force, they'll use it. You saw that with them welding people into their apartments, and people starving to death all across the country because they couldn't leave their home and ran out of money.
And then if you somehow thought that was an aberration, then they've had the zero COVID policy until today. That's still going on, where your factories shut down for a month because there's COVID in the town. And it's like that. You can read all the op-eds you want on an authoritarian regime, but when it hits your pocketbook, that's when the big difference. That's when it makes itself felt.
Yeah, well, I think that's like where the conventional hope of like the political freedom coming along with economic freedom has failed, or like economic prosperity, because China has 20x their per capita wealth, right? 20x or plus, and it doesn't seem like they're pretty much any freer than they were before that, right? And I guess there may be an argument to be made that if China lets the economic growth and wealth accumulate further, it might lead to problems. But they're showing their willingness to cut it off before it becomes a problem, right? And so I
Yeah.
think that's like the big um, letdown, I guess, for a lot of the optimists is like, if you're not going to get the big shift towards political freedom when wealth grew by 20 times, like, and China's just going to shut it down there, like, what was it all for, right? Like, it it's not it's not like the China's facing another 20x in the next 30 years,
Yeah.
even by their own, like, it's just not going to happen again. So the likelihood that,
Yeah, they've hit the point of diminishing returns now. Like,
yeah, and I think that's where it's becomes problematic, because the Xi government, I think, is, like you guys were saying, more than happy to sacrifice some future growth, to maintain, their iron control.
I
And
think a really good example of that is what they've been doing in Hong Kong recently, because Hong Kong had an enormous role to play in the expansion, the explosive growth of China initially in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, because they were a big source of capital allocation from the outside world into China, and basically a more traditional market-based way of allocating capital to successful businesses or enterprises that would make money. And China has clearly decided in the last couple of years that they don't need that culture of sort of capitalism in their country. There was like a sort of a hope among especially the British that the culture of capital allocation from Hong Kong would spread to the exclusive economic zones and then all of China. And now it seems like quite the opposite, in that the repression of the Chinese economic system is spreading into Hong Kong rather than the other way around.
yeah, and I guess I think the reasonable interpretation of all that is like, China has grown enough that they are starting to face these like decision points of like, further growth and further economic efficiency and that kind of thing, or cracking down. And they're choosing to crack down. But I guess like the disappointment from the optimist standpoint is like that they even have that choice, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the optimistic outlook on all of this was like, it wouldn't be a choice. CCP wouldn't have a decision to make about Hong Kong. Hong Kong would just naturally spread their freedom loving ways or whatever to the rest of China, and there wouldn't be a choice for the CCP to make once the wealth had accumulated enough, and once the economic freedom or whatever had done its work in galvanizing support for political freedom. And I guess the big disappointment there is like, the CCP is still in a position where they can choose. And
While we're phrasing it like this, it really brings to mind it's like the capitalist version of the Marxist revolution, where the Marxists were always hoping the workers would revolt, and then it just almost never happened. And it seems like the opposite side of the coin, though, almost the horseshoe theory, if you will. It's like in this case, they were hoping the workers would revolt against the communists once they got wealthy enough.
well, I think in certain ways they are right. It's just like they were hoping that the revolt would be so powerful, it would be unstoppable, right? Like, it would
Mm-hmm.
gather so much steam and momentum that nothing the government did or tried or mandated would have any um, success in slowing down the march towards kind of like a democratic state. And the problem is like, that's just entirely untrue. In China's case, it seems, where if they decide to pull the plug on your you know particular movement, or your or even just say you're a Chinese tech billionaire, and you get a little too big for your bridges in terms of your capitalist leanings, they can still take you down a peg.
Yeah, nobody's immune. Who was the one? It was
Jack
Jack
I can't
Ma.
remember his name.
Yeah.
Jack Ma. Yeah, and it's like, man, if you can take down Jack Ma, nobody's safe. Like,
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's playing out in real time with I mean there is some people that are hopeful that it was just Xi was just kind of like really tightening the screws leading up to his essentially appointment for life or his third term, because in China it's been tradition, I guess, for the last since Mao to only do 2 terms as leader, and Xi is broke with tradition in 2022 by appointing himself for a third term. So some people were hopeful that there would be a bit of a relenting after his appointment to his third term, and he would, but it seems like he took the opportunity during his appointment, because they also elect all the like political appointments at that same time, and he really stacked the deck in favor of his cronies and a lot of CCP like true believers who are not friendly to private enterprise and definitely aren't kind of like in the vein of, say, the slightly older guard that was a little bit more pro-Western, a little bit more open economy types. He's moved away from that even harder in his most recent rounds of appointments. So I think
his
that's
own speech too. Like when they were looking at the speech that he gave, it was much more about moving back towards like true Marxism and state control in terms of the economy and national security. Like his demeanor and his comments have been like much less favorable towards the, again, like it's not really like a free market there, but like private business, and that has a lot of investors in the West very concerned, and a lot of their reactions were to start pulling out.
Well, and I think that actually kind of ties in well to the point of like where the economic growth came from, which again, in the conventional narrative, like the CCP was the catalyst for the economic growth. They used their superior efficiency and planning prowess to tackle all these big society problems and infrastructure problems and build things and start projects and et cetera, et cetera. And I think part of the reason that Xi and his crew are confident in harkening back to like the true party ideology and this like much more Marxist Leninist type talk.
Central economy.
Yeah, is they buy their own hype. Like they buy into that conventional narrative of like it was the CCP and the communist planned economy that caused China's economic miracle, and therefore if they truly do believe that narrative, right? Like why wouldn't you return back to the ideology and the shy away from the private enterprise side of things, because that's not, in your mind, that's not actually what caused the growth. The growth wasn't the fact that you had special economic zones where market forces took hold and, built up businesses, etc. The reason for your success was the CCP government and their efficiency, and therefore more of the same is what you need. And fuck private enterprise. So I think that is another part of Western conventional wisdom that also played into the CCP narrative, like of themselves, right? Where they really think highly of themselves, unsurprisingly. And I mean, I think it'll be very interesting to see if they do go back on a, shy away from private enterprise and really go back to kind of a hardline Leninist approach, how that'll play out for them, because I think a lot of the Western economic fundamentals would argue that it's not gonna play out well. That would be the prediction from, I think, a lot of economists that look at it and would say, it wasn't it. And I think the conventional wisdom is getting challenged there, where it wasn't the CCP's amazing problem solving and planning that drove China's growth. It was just a lot of Chinese workers that were in prime working age, and when you have 1 billion prime working age people that are allowed to contribute to a global economy, it's just a recipe for success, no matter what government is in power.
Well, it sounds like there's also a line of thinking that's arising wherein basically the CCP almost got out of the way of individuals making free enterprise, because there were just so many Chinese individuals that of working age starting their own what should be considered illegal business activities because they were entrepreneurial, that they couldn't be cracked down on. And so then they kind of just stopped saying they were illegal so that you didn't have people getting away with doing all this illegal stuff. And that sort of kickstarted a bunch of their pseudo market economics that laid the groundwork for their big economic revolution that came in the 80s, I think.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that is right. And to further to that point, though, is like some point to like the Cultural Revolution as actually like basically knocking out the central planning system, because the Cultural Revolution targeted a lot of like the central planners themselves, right? Like Mao really went after a lot of like the educated kind of bureaucratic types, and really destabilized the regime and the government apparatus. And so that's in support of your argument. Like the thinking there is like the government had no choice but to get out of the way of your average peasant, because Mao's Cultural Revolution kind of undercut the bureaucracy, and then the Chinese average citizen took the initiative and started doing what they wanted to do from whatever,
or even what they had to do, because the central planning had failed, and all of a sudden if you aren't making shoes in your town and selling them to people, nobody's getting shoes. Like, you get really weird things when central planning breaks down.
Well, and you further like there's less of a scrutinous eye on you, like reporting you back to the central authority and get you know what I mean, like, so you kind of left to your own devices, and lo and behold, humans left to their own devices and allowed to participate in commerce. Can actually get a lot done. And like you were saying, I think then naturally the CCP, once they saw that it already started to kind of flourish, they just started officializing what was already happening, right? Like, oh, well, you're allowed to do this now that you're already doing it. You're allowed to do it because
you can't have these people all breaking the law.
Yeah,
you gotta change the law.
And that's why they had special economic zones. That's the argument, right? Is like, why would you have special economic zones? Well, you want a way to like contain and to monitor the activity that's already happening. You're not the catalyst of why it's happening. You're just regulating essentially, and observing and keeping an eye on what's already naturally taking place. So,
but also then you're not going to end up with it happening everywhere in your country, right? Because the people who are really into it are going to move to those special economic zones to be entrepreneurs.
Yeah, which is exactly why they start them, right? They want it to be observable and concentrated, and so they can still keep. And I think there is an argument there where a lot of economists are, I guess, part of the reason that China is able to still, or the CCP is still able to crack down so effectively on political dissidents and the like a Jack Ma, is because they retain control of a lot of the important sectors of the economy by having these special economic zones. They, like banking, for example, they, the Chinese government has just like incredible control over the banking system, completely unparalleled in comparison to, a Western country.
The way I always see it described is that a lot of their companies that aren't state owned, you'd be remiss to think that they aren't state controlled. Like, it's just because it's not state owned doesn't mean it's not state controlled. They don't do things the government doesn't want them to do.
Yeah, and some of the industries, like some entire industries, are basically still entirely state owned or entirely state controlled, right? Ones that China deemed to be strategically important, right?
Yeah,
they are just under a iron grip.
The big one you see publicized in the West is Huawei, because the argument in the West being this is a state-controlled business, and Huawei says, "Well, I'll tell you the name of every single one of our owners," and then it's just every single employee they have because they're an employee-owned company. See, we're owned by our employees. We're not owned by the state. The Western governments obviously don't buy that and say they're state-controlled because telecoms is such an important strategic interest.
And given like the power that the CCP can exert, like look at as the example of the lockdowns, you'd have to be foolish to think that they can't just step in and, like, even if they don't have a bunch of fingers in a certain company, that they couldn't just go in and take it if they wanted to, right? So there's always the threat of control there as well for even like a shop.
Just go in and write a special regulation that just so happens to only target that one company they don't like, and now all of a sudden it can't compete with its peers. Like,
yeah, and just drag out the top leadership and throw them in a re-education camp, and they'll do whatever you say.
Well, and I guess, yeah, that was like circling back to the main point I was having there. The idea that the CCP's way of running the economy is nothing but upside and is the reason for growth. I think, yeah, again, we're at a point in time where that's going to be tested to the core, right? Like, I think tech in particular is, like, the tech industry in particular in China and, say, the West is like where you're going to see the greatest test of this, because right now the tech industry is like firmly in the crosshairs of the Chinese government. They're strictly regulating it, and I guess, it'll just to see how well it does will be a true test of whether or not, like, the government oversight and the government involvement really does help or hinder, right? So far, it doesn't seem too positive. I mean, the big takeaway from a lot of entrepreneurs and investors in the Chinese tech space has been basically to take a very risk-averse approach post Chinese government intervention. Where
the other thing is that you can say it's been bad is an enormous pullout of capital from Chinese tech. Like, the investors obviously do not think it's a good thing, and they've spoken with their wallets. So there's an immediate downside that's already happened to the Chinese intervention in tech.
Yeah. I guess you could say, though, the counter argument there is like, well, that's like a lot of that's like Western money exiting the space, and part of the reason would be they're worried that the Chinese government may nationalize some of this stuff, or on the flip side, Western governments may force their hand in terms of pulling out the money. Like, you already see, the USA bringing in legislation to essentially force a divorce from the Chinese technology space.
That American legislation, I think, is definitely worth touching on because I don't know, I don't follow trade wars throughout history, but this seems like a pretty significant shot by the Biden administration where any American working on the high-tech silicon industry in China has to leave. And if they're dual citizen and they don't leave, they'll lose their citizenship. And if they're just an American citizen and they don't leave, they'll become a criminal. Like, it's basically you can't work on cutting edge chip manufacturing in China as an American.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can speak my piece on that. It seems like the argument against like doing that from the Biden administration is that it's only going to like spur China to develop their own industry faster than they would have, like rather than, I guess you could say like America would have been, the argument goes that America would have just been better off leaving things as is, because then you make China dependent on America's chips, right? And then therefore they're not incentivized to develop their own, so therefore they're relying on you for something, and then you have leverage. I don't really buy that because, like, personally, I don't really buy that argument because it doesn't seem like China's like willing to be strategically reliant on America for anything that they can.
I think this ties in really well, just because we'll see for sure now whether the CCP can salvage that industry. Like, that industry was so reliant not only on American tech but American human capital. That's all going to get pulled.
Yeah, I mean that the hardware space will be extremely revealing because China is going to replace the Western investment with their own, right? They're not going to just on this, on the software side, on something like a video game company, China might just leave it to wither on the vine, right? Because they're not incentivized to give a shit about a video game company going under or, underperforming. But they will dump hundreds of billions into their chip industry, right? Because it's of supreme importance for the military and their geopolitical kind of aims going forward. So I think that's a really good point by you, and saying like that will really be a good test of whether or not the CCP model of running things will yield the results that the conventional view of like them being all powerful and able to agilely respond to problems.
Just to take a dig at the USSR, because it's always good. We haven't seen communism attempt to really push the tech boundaries because the USSR thought computers were a fad. It's like that was a tough look in retrospect.
Well, and I mean, you can see kind of in the echoes of the USSR, Russia's not having the easiest time with their tech industry being weaned off Western supplies either.
Yeah.
The USSR clearly didn't bequeath a great legacy on Russia in terms of technology. They really don't have any domestic cutting edge fabrication capability whatsoever. I think they have a few like outdated nodes that they can develop can produce, but that's about it.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I mean, not to go too deep into there, but I think the way I understand it, it's not even the chips themselves that's the problem. It's the equipment to make the chips that's the problem. Like, it
has to be an incredibly complicated fabrication process, right?
Well, there's one company that makes all the glass, which is in Germany, and then there's one company that uses the glass to make the actual like lithography machines or whatever the fuck they are.
Lithography,
which is in the Netherlands. And then there's another company that does one other thing. I can't even remember, but there's like another key component of the machinery that's made in the US. And so it's not even the node. Like the individual nodes are obviously very complicated and very difficult, but like the underlying machinery to produce the factories in the first place is like one company in each country that is doing it all, and literally the only company capable for, there's only
It's
one company
incredible
capable.
in that space how much both the human capital and the factories themselves matter. Like you have to have the researchers and the technicians and the engineers that know how to do it and develop it. And then even having the building that can make the things that you need to then make is like there's one in the world. It's
Losing
crazy.
access to that is going to be extremely difficult to come back from. And yeah, I think that's a good point. Like we'll see if China can do that, if the CCP is capable. But they certainly have the money to invest in it, like given how much additional funds that they have from other parts of the economy that could be shifted.
I think that does tie into like kind of the last conventional wisdom point or whatever that is coming to a head, which is like the China continuing to grow at a strong and better than other economy rate until the point that they're just much bigger and richer than say the United States, and just like the easy de facto number one economy in the world. I think that was like the premise of a lot of books and talking points.
Heads.
Yeah, in the early 2000s and 2010s, and I think there's reason to believe that it's not as like rosy for China as all that talk suggested, and that they may run into just some serious problems, and multifaceted problems, like quite a few interconnected and complex issues that will challenge their just straight line trajectory to number one. I don't know. I think we can touch on a few of them.
The obvious one that I think is pretty well becoming universally understood, especially in this case of China, is the demographic crisis. For the most recent number I could find was for 2020, and they had 20% lower births in 2020, which it's the lockdown, so that was probably an especially bad year, but they're nowhere near even a replacement rate, let alone growing. I think it's 1.3 children per woman in China now, and replacement rate is about 2.4, 2.5 to keep your population steady. So they're
2.1 does the trick.
Okay. I guess with the lower mortality rate, yeah.
Yeah, I think China is reasonably advanced in their medicine. That 2.1 would be doable.
Yeah, although you have to consider the environmental factors. It's still a severe public health risk that most industrial nations don't have to worry about the amount of coal they burn in China. 60% of their power generation is coal plants, and before they really started cleaning up their act, they were having thousands of people die a day, thousands of excess mortality per day attributed to air pollution in China. So they're not living their best possible lives by any means in most of those cities.
Yeah, I agree. They definitely have worse outcomes, but I'm sure.
Yeah,
I would assume
either way, they're way below replacement, and so that is just going to lead to a smaller and smaller workforce, which the optimists will point to the fact that they're investing incredibly high amounts into automation. So at this point, there are about 1/3 of all industrial robots being built are working in factories in China. And that'll probably only increase, excepting if this US chip ban really tanks the robot industry. This is a big area where they could get payoff from investing into their tech industry, because they need better tech to offset the lack of workers, and they need it now. So there's as much incentive as you could ever want for the tech industry. And the pessimists say that it's not going to come fast enough, and it's going to start impacting the consumption, because you won't have people making a wage to consume things, which means that you won't have people to make the things, which means there'll be less jobs, and then you have that vicious cycle. And all at the same time, they're trying to support their parents and grandparents as they age, because China doesn't have a great social welfare system that can deal with old age security that well. And they're going to have way more old people. It's just there are a ton of problems for them to overcome, and basically the optimists think with automation they might be able to, and the pessimists think they just won't be able to.
I think I'll just pile on to the pessimist case. Like, I think the pessimist case is strengthened by like making the comparison to Japan, because Japan had a lot of parallels in terms of obviously some differences, but they had a lot of parallels with China in the 1980s, and a lot of similar predictions about them, being number one economy very soon. And more or less, like, they just hit the demographic wall and then declined. And it's not like they're not a major economy. It's just they're not the number one. And
You could say Japan managed to basically stall. Like their economy now is functionally very similar to how it was in the 1980s. They have almost no inflation, they have almost no cost of living increases, and they have almost no wage increases. And their economy grows at a steady like 1% maybe.
if they're lucky, if they can torture the inflation stats and the other stats enough, that's
For
growing.
people who do investing in markets, for the Japanese market, the ideal leverage over time has been 0.5, because you want to half leverage. You want to buy shorts as well as longs on the market so that you're half leveraged to get the optimal return on the Japanese market. That's how slow it grows.
Well, and I think there's been a lot of stats touted about, like, I think it was just within the last few years where their stock market recently hit parity with its levels in 1980.
Yeah.
I don't think that it doesn't include dividends, I don't think, but it is just a pretty.
That's true. That was a few years ago.
It is a pretty, like, informative point of reference, just to show how, like, how bubbly Japan got, and then how it just.
It wouldn't be the worst case scenario for China if they went the way of Japan, because as you're saying, and as we're talking about, Japan has stayed pretty steady as a strong economy in the world. It didn't ruin everybody's life. It wasn't a Great Depression. It just kind of went from growing like crazy to complete stagnation.
Yeah, kind of fizzled out into a steady state, right? And I think the other parallel I was going to make with Japan is, I believe Japan right now is the number one most automated economy in the world by a fairly sizable amount. They have the most robots per capita working, with, I think, Germany is like a somewhat distant second, although not bad, but still lagging Japan. And so, like, like China, even if they automate rapidly and catch Japan, like Japan, even with their current rates of automation, is stagnant completely. And actually, Japan is contemplating some level of immigration to offset their lack of workforce, essentially, because they're aging even more than they've just continued to age, I guess is the way to put it. And they are
Interesting. Never would have expected that.
Well, yeah, obviously, and they're continuing to run into further problems with basically keeping the lights on in terms of getting work done. And
it definitely looks like China's demographic problem is pretty similar to Japan's, just delayed a bit, right? Like, from what I recall from the podcast that we did on demography, like,
it's almost like it's a little it's delayed in our sense of time, but if you look on a graph, I think it was sped up by the one-child policy.
It's compressed, I guess, is a better.
Yeah, that's the word.
It's like they basically got, like, the transition from like a classic Malthusian birth rate scenario where people are just having as many kids as they can unregulated, and you get a very, I guess, wide pyramid in that situation, if you can imagine a population pyramid. And then because of the one-child policy, was like layered on with industrialization, which also leads to reduction in childbirth. Like, within the span of 30 years, they went to, like, from above replacement births to well below. And I would say there's a couple other, like, factors that make it even worse for China than, say, Japan, which was gender imbalance. Like
Yeah,
some of the estimates are like a 3-to-2 men to women ratio in
depending on
like
the area. Yeah.
the younger generations. And obviously just that's going to lead to lower birth rates because you're just going to have less pairing offs.
Unlike some people, we'll tell it to you straight. Men can't have kids. That's why it's the lower birth rate.
Well,
Wow,
Price,
bigot.
I think you just got us kicked off air for bigotry.
Yeah.
Well, no, because Elon Musk's bought Twitter, so at least we could post there. Say whatever we want.
This is going to be a real long tweet longer.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone is going to read it.
Yeah, so I mean that just like makes it worse, right? Like, so I think if anything, like China has like a more compressed and even steeper, worse demographic situation than Japan. Although very similar. Like, there's definitely a lot of similarities, and South Korea. I mean,
The
South
other
Korea
problem with China that they face that is different than Japan is Japan can consider upping immigration, and they definitely have a bit even already. But how do you up immigration when you have 1 billion people living in your country? Like, just the scale of the immigration you need compared to a place like Japan is off the charts.
Yeah,
like, there's
dude.
not that many immigrants in the world to really bring in.
That is a good point. Where like if China is going to solve their problem through immigration, or try to, they would have to basically, in absolute terms, import 10 times as many people as Japan would say consider importing, right? Because they're roughly about 10 times larger than Japan. So it's just where are you going to get that many immigrants? Like, I mean, India would be the kind of more or less clear answer in terms of places that are growing enough to send people.
And you want to go countries in Africa as well might be able to, but
for raw numbers, the Congo, and I think it's the Congo, might be able to supply a good chunk of immigrants, but that's just throwing out all the political considerations.
Yeah,
well, I was going to say with India that you got India, and Africa, and India is not exactly like political buds with China, so I don't think they would be very happy to see we're going to import 100 million
into China.
And I don't think, to be honest, I don't think a ton of
Indians would also accept that.
Indians would be that enthusiastic, given like the relationship between the two countries. So like immigration requires a willing party to immigrate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, unless they want to start kidnapping millions of people.
There's a certain institution that survived in the American South for quite a while that didn't require willingness.
As we've seen, China's not opposed to that level of behavior.
But it's certainly more complicated than just, approving the visas, which Japan, I think, would be in a situation to do so, right? Like, if Japan opened the proverbial floodgates to, immigration applications.
A lot of Westerners trying to flood over there.
Well, I think you'd get adequate applications to fill the roll call, essentially, right? And again, China would have to really get creative to do the same thing, and I don't think it would really work out the same way. So
they're just gonna have to start growing human beings in vats.
Well, the other pessimistic take, I guess, on the whole demographic situation in China is like, there's a lot of talk around like, oh, well, the CCP is, again, they're authoritarian and they're, centrally planned. Well, they can just like tell people to have kids, like easy peasy. Like, you just start, bringing all sorts of programs in to incentivize it, and then worst case scenario, you just start getting, reverse one-child policy, and you say 3-child mandatory policy or whatever. The problem with that even if it would work, which there's good reasons to believe that it would be very hard, even with like strong authoritarian action, to actually generate a sizable increase in childbirth. Like, it's going to be a 20-year lag before anything actually comes out of it, right? And the big demographic crunch for China is actually coming in the next 10 and 20 years. And it's all around
They'd
like
have to hit that plan full scale in the next 2 years, basically, is what
Well, they
you're
would
saying.
have had to have hit it about 5 or 6 years ago to
20
really.
years ago it would have been ideal,
Yeah.
but like yeah, they would have to double their birth rate overnight, and even then
You'd
they
still
will
have
suffer for the next 20 years because like if you look at the numbers, China's working age population was roughly about 58% of their entire population in 1978, and that went up to 74% in 2010 and is expected to drop down to 58% by 2040. So like, if you just look at that, like 2040, that's 18 years from now. You're already looking at like that over the next 20 years is when the real crunch happens.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if
I don't have much more to say on the demographic problem, but yeah, it is, I think.
I think it's their number one problem, and like
Yeah. Well, that's
it's not
that's
just
really
China,
what killed Japan, their economic growth. So
I've got some stuff on what I would consider their number 2 problem, and that's energy, because they still don't consume energy at a rate that's comparable per capita with developed countries. So like America, just they're built different in America. They consume a lot of electricity, and one would assume that China's goal is to hit what America's doing, or at least be capable of hitting that. And right now, 60% of their electricity is generated by coal. So that's a huge problem because they're still building new coal plants. They've built in the last 10 years enough new coal plants in China to offset all of the coal plants in the rest of the world that have been put offline. And they're still dealing with issues like rolling blackouts. And in a lot of cases, those are happening on hot summer days where people are just running so much AC. And running that AC has become, in the modern world, a sort of middle-class comfort. You want your house to be a comfortable temperature. So the CCP knows that. And what they have to do then to try and mitigate these negative effects on the population is order thousands of businesses to shut down operations for up to a week at a time in order to try and keep the grid able to handle the air conditioning costs during the heat waves. And the biggest problem it sounded like with the heat wave this year was that it came with a drought, which probably isn't that unlikely. And the majority of the electricity in that southeastern province is generated by hydropower, and they don't want to run their dams out of water. So they have to reduce the amount of hydropower they're producing. So then they have less electricity and they have higher draws because of the drought and heat wave hitting at the same time.
yeah, double whammy then.
And that's just basically the future for, I mean, to be one of those people who always talks about climate change, but like you've got to take that into account as being a likely occurrence in the future. So what they are doing is heavily investing in renewable electricity. They now have they have half of the world's offshore wind capacity, and almost all of that was built in the last year, which is incredible. So they have a ton of renewables, but their renewable development, while being an order of magnitude, if not orders of magnitude, ahead of any other country in the world, is still lagging the raw demand for power that you see coming out of their population as they grow wealthier. They buy 40% of the air conditioners that are sold on Earth are bought in China.
Fucking ludicrous.
So
I think I just like I'm from what I've seen as well, like China isn't particularly great in terms of its geography for renewables. Like they have a lot of it because they've like brute forced just building a lot of it, but they don't actually have a ton of
It's not ideal, right?
So-
like ideal locations.
they don't have like ideal solar, they don't have ideal wind.
I ran into that. Like that's why their offshore is so big, because all their big population centers are by the ocean. So offshore wind makes a ton of sense. But you're absolutely right in that they don't have good renewable potential near any major population centers. So right now in the world, there are 36 ultra high voltage power lines that carry electricity ridiculous distances, thousands of kilometers, and 34 of those 36 are in China because they do have some good renewable potential. Like they have quite a bit of good renewable potential, but it's in completely depopulated areas of Western China and some of Northern China for wind in mountains. And basically getting those to market is a big problem. And you run into a very, what people wouldn't assume to be a problem in a centrally planned economy, where because the electricity is being generated in a province other than the one it's being purchased in, there's almost a disincentive for the province to buy that electricity because they're in charge of supplying their electricity. So they want to buy electricity from a power plant in their province. So they're going to prioritize buying a coal-fired power plant's electricity out of their province to keep the wealth in the province and circulating in their local GDP, which is another problem of a centrally planned economy, is that they'll often have GDP targets. So they want to keep their local GDP as high as possible. So they're not even fully utilizing the renewable electricity that's being generated in the west of China because the eastern provinces are, in many cases, disincentivized from buying it, which just doesn't make a whole lot of sense from the idea that, you know, there's a big cohesive plan. But there's something to be done there. For instance, they managed to fix their problem with coal-fired plants basically turning off because they set the price of electricity. You're not allowed to sell it for more than that. So some of the coal-fired plants just said they were down for maintenance instead of selling electricity at a loss, which then reduced the amount of electricity and caused blackouts. So when reviewing the incident, the CCP decided that they would allow variable rates to be sold to businesses, although farmers and houses still have a set rate. But it'll somewhat ease the burden on these electricity producers effectively being forced to sell electricity at a loss when coal is expensive. And also their coal miners had a set price they could sell the coal for, which at some point wasn't high enough to mine the coal in the first place. So then they weren't producing domestic amounts of coal that were particularly high, and they scrapped that. So they can fix these sort of logistical problems that arise, like the problem with renewables is probably on the slate, but it's a problem that exists that is just bizarre.
Well, and I mean, on top of their renewable problem, they also just buy a ton of hydrocarbons, right? And
Yeah,
they
75% of their gas and I believe 60% of their oil is imported. But it's a big problem for them that they don't have natural gas because that's what almost every other country in their sort of wealth bracket is moving towards, building more natural gas fired plants. But right now they don't get a lot of natural gas outside of liquid natural gas, which is obviously very expensive. And luckily for the world, right now they are in a slump, so they're buying 15% less natural gas than they were last year. But it's going to be pricey if they come back on the market for liquid natural gas.
Well, yeah, but it's not a great situation to be in, I guess, like going forward for them from an economic standpoint, right? They really are, when you're importing so much of your hydrocarbons, those are extremely, demand sensitive, and if the market goes out of whack for them for whatever reason, like a invasion of Ukraine,
Yeah.
and the price spikes, then you're just, China's not unique. They're going to have to pay the market price, and that could get very expensive and very damaging to their economy very quickly.
One kind of cheat they use is buying stuff off people other people won't buy from, which works for oil but not gas as much, because obviously they're buying a ton off of Iran, and now their biggest supplier is Russia for oil and coal. Actually, Indonesia might still be higher for coal, but they're enormously invested in Russian stuff that's not getting to the rest of the world because it's cheap.
Yeah, it's just there's no guarantee. There's always going to be a pariah that you can buy off of, right?
Yeah.
And I think this brings up just like a small small point I wanted to get in at some point, which is China, I think, got a bit worried about. They got clued in, I guess, to the importance of PR essentially with the Russia invasion, and they noticed how like isolated and fucked over Russia got economically from their decision to invade, and it actually like really, I think, kind of shook China to see how like unified the West was with slapping sanctions on. And the thing I think that they didn't anticipate, like the sanctions were more or less expected, although I think they were a bit heavier than China anticipated, was the boycott. Like I think it's now over 1,000 companies have pulled out of Russia, Western companies.
Yeah, so that's like an enormous brain drain, right?
Well, it's human capital, it's actual capital, it's all sorts of things, right? And it's also the other thing that like the other thing is like people are like Western companies and Western consumers and stuff are also willing to boycott Russian products, like not buy stuff made in Russia. And that's like even worse for China because where do they sell everything? They export it for sale in Western markets. So I think you know, them, you know, kind of colluding with the priors of the world is not, they were pretty careful about adhering to the sanctions of Russia so that they didn't get secondary sanctions slapped onto them, just because they saw that it could actually be quite damaging at a time that, you know, China is actually kind of, like Price was saying earlier, in a bit of a slump right now, and they don't want more of a slump. So I guess that's just something to consider, is like energy markets or whatever else it is. Like China does have to, I think they've finally seen that they might have to be a bit more careful about their, I guess, PR situation, and that might actually cause them to make real sacrifices with consequence in terms of who they buy for or who they export to, or et cetera, to avoid secondary sanctions and avoid boycott. And yeah, that could be a problem. And just to like one final little fine point on there is that like the sentiment towards China in the West has like flipped on a dime over the last 20 years. It's like insane how
like
big of
10 years, isn't it?
Well, it depends which country you look, but like a lot of some of the countries moved like 15 years ago in terms of their sentiment. Some was like 5 years ago. Some was like 2020. So it does depend on which country.
Some always hated China.
True, but like so
Very
like
few.
the most stark example is Australia, and they went from 52% of Australian citizens having a favorable view of China, with 40% having unfavorable, and then I think the 8 was like undecided, essentially neutral.
Another good one is like Japan, very similar. 55 liked China, and now it's 86 dislike China. And these, like Australia and Japan, are constantly doing business with China. Like they're very exposed to China at all times.
Yeah, to finish the Australia numbers, like they went from 52-40 to 81 unfavorable and 15% favorable. So that's like such a crazy shift in sentiment. And that's, again, like for Australia, that like almost all that movement happened in the last 5 years. And that was over, I think the big needle mover there in Australia was they had like basically trade disputes with China, and China tried to bully them. And
also, I know there were a few very high-profile incidents of Australian politicians getting big payouts by Chinese companies, like Chinese lobby firms working in Australia, which is terrible optics.
Yeah, and so, but I think that the logic, like the problem there is like a lot of these places that right now buy, say, Chinese consumer goods or whatever, or are willing to send oil to China or whatever, or willing to send raw material, et cetera, the ground's already laid for them to be willing to stop that economic activity if something further happens, right? Like, I think if you 10 years ago, if you were to ask Australians, like, oh, would you support like a export ban on XYZ commodity to China because they did this? When 52% of your population is favorable, probably not. You probably wouldn't get broad political support for something like that uh, in Australia. Now that 81% of people have an unfavorable view of China, I think I think that would be a different story. I think if the Australian government floated say a coal ban, because Australia produces a lot of coal to China, yeah, I think you might get Australia saying, hell yeah, sign us up. We might lose some money, but fuck them.
It's a really good example because what Australians did do in mid 2020 was push harder than anybody else in the world for proper investigation into the origins of COVID. And in response to that, the Chinese actually banned a significant chunk of Australian imports, including coal. So they were willing to bite that economic bullet for the political gain that came with condemning China publicly in the international forum. I believe it was the UN. They were calling for investigation into China, and it was just politically viable. And economically, it didn't hurt very much. Like right now, with the current price of coal and how all these things work out, even if China wasn't banning Australian coal, they wouldn't be buying it because Australian coal is needed in Europe to run their coal-fired power plants that they're rebooting, whereas China can burn lower quality coal that's cheaper for the electricity. So it didn't hurt Australia too much economically, but they were willing to take the risk and get punished in order to condemn China.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see more of that going forward. So it is, I mean, that was a bit of a tangent on like the main point about energy, but I think it's an important tangent just to say that, China has a vulnerability there that I think it was exposed with the the Russia-Ukraine situation, like really exposed it to China and to other people, right? Like I think there was a big question mark on whether or not Western countries would be willing to feel any sort of pain in order to say, enforce some demands against, say, a China or a Russia. And I think the answer is a bit surprising in the direction of yes. Like, Germany's going through a lot with their energy situation and because of the cutoff of Russian gas, but they're willing to do it. It seems like by and large.
German preppers are now stockpiling wood for the winter. Like that's the level Germany's reached. They're getting ready for it.
So could you see a American population willing to pay higher prices on consumer goods in order to shift away from China? I think it's possible. I think the conventional answer 5 years ago would have been no. Like
Yeah, not a damn chance.
Not a penny higher.
Yeah.
But I think that perception has changed, which is, for better or for worse, true.
Yeah, I think there's a couple other points on just like the Chinese economy, like now and going forward. Price, you mentioned that they're in a bit of a slump, and that's definitely what I came up, like a lot of the research that I had done indicated, and wanted to touch on a couple of those points. I think everybody probably knows that like the COVID is a big part of that, but which is like that their zero COVID policy has obviously shut a lot of stuff down and like destroyed a lot of demand. But one of the other things that I think is good to touch on is just the overall just poor capital allocation that has happened. One of the things that came up quite a bit when I was doing research was like China does invest an enormous amount of its GDP, like not of its actual GDP, but as a proportion of their GDP, they invest about 40 to 45% back into various projects, which is like unheard of. Like they do, that's much larger compared to any other country in the world. And for them, a huge amount of that, 30% of that reinvestment or investment is in real estate, and the other 30% roughly is into infrastructure. So one of the things that happened with China starting about 2005, like we were saying that they were, the conventional story held true, that they shot up in terms of their growth. But then from about 2005 onwards, the growth that they were experiencing was extreme debt fueled. So their ratio of debt to GDP started to get a lot larger. So in order to push the growth higher and higher, they were just throwing huge amounts of money through like gaining the cash through debt issuance. So like bonds and whatnot. A lot of that's done by the Chinese populace. Like they would buy lots and lots of bonds, and then they would pump that money into the real estate and into a lot of their infrastructure, and that stuff that worked really well to like stave off like the 2008 crash. They didn't really have a recession in China, so that worked pretty well. But because they kept inflating their debt faster than their GDP was growing, a lot of that growth was non-productive, meaning that they weren't actually getting proper returns on that investment. So a good example of that is like the rail lines. They built a whole bunch of high-speed rail lines, and they went on a huge spending spree for that. And now a lot of those things are very expensive, and a lot of the various lines that they built no longer make even enough operating income to service the interest payments on the debt. So basically a ton of their capital now has been tied up into these big projects that aren't producing a lot. So they've gotten themselves, and this again goes back to Japan, like we were talking about before. This is another big similarity where that's what Japan did. They ran super high debts and then in order to generate the growth, but that's not really sustainable over the long term. Like you can try it, but
Japan's been doing it for 40 years.
Yeah, Japan's been doing it, but then
sustaining the growth, but staying alive.
Yeah, it keeps you going. But they also like a part that was done in the 20s as well in the States, and that wound up in a big disaster. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but that was kind of, it's a close analogy. And so China kind of is sitting in a precarious situation in the sense that they can either try to keep going with this way, and maybe they're going to do that, and you'll wind up with the Japanese situation where you're very likely to just like your growth is going to grind out and then stay at low levels. And Xi has kind of indicated that he wants lower growth but genuine growth. He doesn't want this debt fueled stuff. And they have been bringing in a lot of restrictions on companies like real estate to make sure that they're not over leveraged, because they have a pretty rough property market, which we could probably touch on in a little bit here. But because of the poor allocation of capital into a lot of, like, they have huge cities that are just dead. Like there's tons and tons of these apartment buildings that are built that have nobody in them. It's actually pretty wild if you look up pictures of them. They're just,
I know a big causal factor in a couple of those at least was the GDP growth targets that provinces were set, and basically to pump the numbers without just straight out lying, they awarded massive construction contracts that then spent a ton of government money and then paid people a bunch of money, and then those people spent the money and then it boosted their GDP. And then it's like, oh yeah, this was a useless construction project of a city in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, they have a few of those, which is wild. Like, can you imagine that in Canada or America, where you just have this huge, basically ghost city? It's just empty.
Well, it's all made of concrete, which is crazy. Like, I believe the stat was in between 2010 and 2020, China poured more concrete than America has in its entire history. Just unbelievable amounts of production and construction going on there.
Yeah,
Well,
it's something else. It's a good way to keep your economy quote unquote growing, but a lot of it is not. It's not real, genuine growth, and that's a pretty big concern because it doesn't represent proper economic activity, and eventually you will hit that point where you have to retool your economy. Like that was one of the um, economists that I was reading, like that, like when, because countries have had this happen before, and when that happens, for a country like China, you don't have a lot of places to go. You can either kind of just keep running it, and hopefully your debt situation doesn't actually implode with a credit crisis, because that could be bad. But you can do what Japan did, basically just keep it going, and your growth will slow right down to a crawl. They could also just try to shift the improperly allocated capital to a different sector, like into tech, which, with the silicon, they might actually look to do. And that does seem to be probably like at least a part of the solution. One of the other things they could do is they can actually try to boost up consumption within the country. China actually has they're very interesting in the sense that they really don't consume nearly as much as a percentage of their GDP. They have like 55% of their domestic consumption, or as a proportion of GDP, domestic consumption sits at about 55%, which is much lower than like basically all the other countries. Most countries consume a lot more than that. And so they could try to shift the investment into just driving actual consumption by the Chinese citizenry. But there's some problems with that. Like you'd actually have to push either businesses to start to consume less, or you'd have to get the governments to stop doing that. Like it has to come from somewhere. Because you have a limited amount of stuff that you actually like goods and services to consume. And the author was basically saying like it's kind of hard because you would have to either push the businesses out, and because the businesses actually don't consume much, like they consume right around what like an average like country's business does consume, then it kind of leaves the government that would have to be pushed down. But because the like politically no government, like regional, local, wants to lose that ability to spend, it would be seen as like probably met with some pushback. But again, with Xi's consolidation of power, it's likely that it's, he could get it done for sure. And then another one.
And would it be? It might just be considered antithetical to his ideology because he wants to restore the sort of primacy of the party, of the CCP in China's life.
Yeah.
So why would he want to reduce the power of the local governments?
Well, he could just tell them that they're going to be spending less, and then kind of couch it as like, oh no, it's going to be the nationals doing it, right? Whereas but he's also said that prosperity. What was it?
Common prosperity.
Yeah, common prosperity. So he is looking to move towards more like quote unquote egalitarian vision of like Leninist vision, right? And so it could be like as couching it as like a redistribution, but it still probably has political implications that might be challenging to actually overcome. And then another thing that you could do, well, that's actually, I think that's pretty much basically like the 5 paths, at least that in this author, like from historical standpoint and from where the Chinese economy sits, like they are kind of stuck, and they're going to face some, like going forward is going to be kind of tricky to navigate that. He does, the other thing is you could just take a massive short-term hit in terms of a big recession, and then that causes, like, then you have the opportunity to start to reallocate. But he doesn't really, it's probably unlikely because that would reflect very poorly upon Xi, right? Like if he just caused like a huge economic burn up, especially after full consolidation of power, that's going to reflect very poorly on him. So it's likely that they're just going to have to try to slow down growth. And Xi kind of did indicate that he would prefer lower growth that is real. So it's interesting, in terms of looking at where they can go trying to move away from their massive investments in real estate and in infrastructure that is just poor capital allocation is it's a really big deal, and trying to fix that culture and that problem is gonna be another very big challenge going forward that I don't think is, they're not going to be able to just fix it within a year, but they're going to have to try something.
Well, I mean, I think it falls under like the malinvestment terminology, and obviously, I think lots of countries in the low interest rate environment struggle with malinvestment because you bring down the cost of capital very low and basically hand out cheap money, free money. You're going to get a lot of essentially high risk attempts to put it somewhere that gets a nice return, and a lot of that's going to be very unproductive assets that end up you get zombie companies, etc. So you get that even in Western economies that are much more market driven in low interest rate environments. So I can see China having that be multiples worse when you combine low interest rate environments with perverse incentives of all the sorts of centrally planned economy stuff where you have to hit GDP metrics, and you have to hit investment metrics, and you have to all these other confounding variables that force you into bad decisions. So I think that will be a big problem going forward. Is they're going to have this basically hangover, epic hangover of binging on random investment, and the West is going to have it too with the low interest rates, but I think China's is going to be even more acute.
I think what I heard was happening in China during the low interest rate environment that was qualitatively different than the West is that so many of the companies that were borrowing this almost free money were also effectively state-backed, or at least considered themselves to be effectively state-backed. It was a big deal a couple of years ago when China started letting some of these companies that investors had considered state-backed actually have failures and not bending over backwards to cover for the company making a terrible gamble. So you had, not only do you have free money, but you had a lot of companies that basically had a sense of invincibility because if they really messed up, the government's got their back. Well, they have no budget constraint because there's free money, and they have no risk sense because if they really mess up, the government will fix it and it'll be better. It was a really crazy environment.
Yeah, so it's like the Western situation, just even worse, right? It's just an exaggerated version of that, where you're making decisions with very little feedback on what's actually useful for the future in terms of investment. That's the problem with low interest rates for a prolonged period of time, is that you start to lose track of the feedback mechanism of actually rolling a profit, and the profit is telling you that you're investing in future productivity. And then you get, after a period where you're not getting that feedback, you wind up with a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually produce for the future, which is definitely Con was mentioning, that can be stuff like high-speed rail to nowhere that doesn't have the passenger quantity to even pay for its own debts.
Mm-hmm. I think an interesting thing that I would, from my understanding, describe as cultural, that it's almost a meta misallocation of capital. And it's the fact that a lot of incredibly wealthy Chinese allocate their capital towards real estate, or even middle-class Chinese would allocate their capital towards real estate instead of the stock market.
I'm going to blow your mind. It's actually even lower-class Chinese. Everyone in China allocates.
And it's basically a cultural requirement.
It's could you call it a misallocation of, it's a misallocation of capital into real estate, but in the sense, they aren't even capable, like it's not considered to allocate that capital in any other way. They're not on a stock market where they could buy stocks in another company or anything like that. They're like, I have money, I'm going to go buy real estate. That's how I'll make more money, which is like a cultural phenomenon that it leads to a bunch of unowned homes and tons of
You
speculation.
mean unoccupied?
Yeah, unoccupied homes, unhomed peoples, unpeopled homes.
Yeah, unpeopled homes. There you go.
Yeah. So that's a bizarre aspect that I recall even 5 years ago reading about the CCP trying to figure out what they could do to make people stop buying empty houses and not living in them. And it sounded like they basically came to no firm conclusions. It's just the way that capital is allocated in China is they view real estate as a better investment than the stock market in a lot of cases.
Well, I think there's a couple things there. One is like in a lot of cases, like for the last 40 years, it has been a better investment because
that's a good point. They're getting the reinforcement.
Real estate has just marched. I think there's been one period in the last 40 years that real estate declined. There was a one decline ever in Chinese real estate since I think the 70s. So yeah, it's just like, I mean, if there's a asset class that's been marching straight up for 40 years, it's going to be hard to get people to move away from it. And I think they've basically created a classic bubble in real estate, and that's I think why the government has come to the conclusion that there's nothing they can do, because all the actual options, and I mean this, funnily enough, like there's some Western countries that have a very similar situation. Like the cold hard truth is like the real answer to how do you get people to not invest in real estate anymore is you pop the bubble and you let it explode everywhere, right? And then
down.
And then you're gonna have a generation of investors that are bitten by real estate, and they will shy away from it, right? And it won't be seen as that like bulletproof investment, but that requires popping the bubble, right? And for some political reasons in China, that's doesn't seem to be like an option on the table. One of them is like provincial governments in China are highly basically caught up in the whole bubble because
they're the ones funding a ton of it, right?
They're not funding it, they're funding themselves through it. They're one of the beneficiaries of the bubble. So if it pops, they will actually, a lot of them will be in huge financial trouble. There's basically two primary reasons I could glean for like the provincial governments being so heavily tied up and fucked over in this situation. One is one of the only ways that they're allowed to generate revenue is land sale and land leasing. So that's just obvious, right? They're gonna have a huge incentive to get as much real estate developed as they can and at as high a value as they can, right? Because if they can sell their municipal real estate to a developer who's going to build apartment buildings, and they sell it at a heavily inflated price because the demand for real estate is so sky high, they make more money. So that's obviously just the incentive for them to continue the merry-go-round of pumping up the real estate bubble. The other thing that they did is, from my understanding, is they're not really allowed to lend. They have some pretty heavy restrictions on being able to get loans from the banks. So what a lot of the provincial governments did is they created these these shell corporation investment vehicles that they then gave land to, and then they used the land as a collateral for bank loans to create liquidity and cash flow for the provincial governments. So actually a lot of like the balance sheet of provincial governments is being backed up by land values. And it doesn't show on the books because it's through these shell corporations, but obviously the national government knows about it and is concerned because again, if the bubble pops, then these loans become bad because they're not backed, but they're
only backed by the land as the collateral.
The land value, and so if the land value goes down 75%, boom, your loan's underwater and it's a big problem. All of a sudden, it's a problem, right? As anyone who lived through 2008 and saw housing go underwater in the U.S. knows, when stuff goes underwater, it can create a lot of problems. So yeah, they have like two avenues of exposure, the provincial governments. And then obviously the CCP doesn't want to pop the bubble and basically piss off the average person who's, in a lot of cases, entire life savings and retirement fund and everything is tied up in real estate. And like Price was saying, a lot of the time it's not even occupied homes. For example, 2018, 87% of the home sales in 2018 were second or third or plus homes, not primary residences. And as we were alluding to earlier in the podcast, the demographics don't support, loading up on housing for the future, because all indications that that we can see and the UN can see is that the population is actually set for a fairly steep decline, not increase. And it's not like these homes are going to be desired by a big influx of population in the future. And it's a great investment from that standpoint. It's like, if anything, they're going to be dynamiting more of these empty fake cities that are full of no one.
You're just not seeing the appeal of having a house for every separate day of the week. That's the future.
Yeah, you got your Friday house, your Sunday house. Yeah, I'm not sure if that,
where you can be
again,
visited
going back to
by your one friend because everybody else is gone.
Well, having a friend, I don't know. You're not going to be able to handle that with the 12-hour days you're working.
Yeah.
Again, going back to malinvestment, I'm not sure if a days of the week house is really in the top 5 for investments.
Actually, kind of like to pick up on that point there. It's like working the 12-hour days. There's a little bit it's a bit of a smaller thing, but it's interesting. One of the cultural things that seems to be going on in China. This is actually seen around the world as well, but there does seem to be with the youth. There's really high unemployment, so it's 20% of, I think it's like, what is it, 18 to 24 or something, 26 year olds.
So.
Somewhere around there. It's 20% unemployment. Part of that's due to COVID lockdowns, and I think clamping down on tech and whatnot has really damaged that. But quite a few, like, there's a youth movement now of called Tang Ping, and it means lying flat, meaning like not working really, really hard to then for the rewards that come with that, right? Because a lot of and this is related to the housing, because the housing is so expensive. I think a lot of Chinese people, the youth, were noticing that it's going to take them 40 to 50 years of work to even pay off one apartment. So a lot of them are feeling pretty disenfranchised and disheartened that they're going to have to work so hard to not really be able to get much out of it. So Tang Ping is this, it's a youth movement of, like, it translates to laying flat or lying flat, meaning you just don't work very hard, kind of put in what you need to get some money to survive, and then, just enjoy yourself, enjoy your hobbies and your friends, and relax. And you definitely saw that's also kind of cropping up in the West as well.
That's been around for a long time.
It's been around in the West for.
But now it's been decades. Rebranded. That's quiet quitting.
Yeah. It's just another rebranding, because
I don't like rebranding. Slacker culture was a vibe, like 90s, and it'd be the skater dude who'd work at the video rental store part-time, just enough to stay alive, and skate every time he's not working.
Yeah, it's definitely been around in the West for a lot longer, but now you see the new phase of it with the Gen Z. But it's interesting because apparently this is also kind of like changed, like this Tang Ping has also, I guess in some places has evolved to like let it rot, like a different one where they're just like basically do the absolute bare minimum, don't give a shit at all, because, you know, like, you're not going to get anywhere from working really hard. And Xi Jinping himself has addressed this, basically criticizing it and telling the young people, like, no, you got to work hard. Like, you're our future. You can't sit around, you know, apathetically. You got to contribute to the glory of China. But I found that very interesting, because I think it really does tie into like the demographic problem, in the sense that a lot of people are having to work really, really hard, because they're now starting to hit the effects are now starting to bite. And so there's less people around to do the work. And so the younger people are going to have to, they're being pretty much required to work long hours, and it's burning them out. COVID also really, I think, hammered them pretty good as well, being locked in your apartment for fucking 2 years. But like that, plus like then the really high housing costs, like the housing bubble, just has led to, I think, this general sentiment spreading amongst the youth. And it will be, you know, like if that takes hold and really spreads to a decent chunk of the youth worker or workforce, that could actually have some pretty serious implications for their economy, because, you know, you don't have a lot of people to replace those who are retiring, and if they're not willing to put in good hours, then, or take on harder jobs, well, then you're really screwed.
I think the lying flat is kind of an issue that the Chinese are worried about, but it's like, you know, these guys are just lacking ambition, and that's a problem. But as I understood it, the let it rot, that's a proper sort of cultural contagion that it is going to cause damage if it really catches on. Because in the article I read, which is probably translated 6 times from the original sources, but basically the idea is not so much to just give up on things. That's kind of the lie flat. Like, you don't need things to be happy. You can just kind of eat and enjoy yourself with your friends.
Just relax.
But the let it rot is like, give up on your future. It's like, oh, I should be saving money, but those are some nice shoes, so I'll just take out some money from my line of credit, buy those shoes, because nothing matters anyway. The future doesn't matter. There's no reason to not do this. Like, just do literally anything, because truly nothing matters. Like, it's proper nihilism.
Yeah, I was going to say, that is like the true nihilistic viewpoint. And yeah, I could see that. Like, if that really does spread, like, that's completely counterproductive. Whereas at least with Tang Ping, it's lying flat is,
lying flat's not self-destructive. Useful. It's just boring.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's just like you're not being like the proper socialistic worker, but you're not actually causing problems. Whereas the other one is, no, you're actively damaging things around you.
Or yourself.
Yeah, well, yourself, and then therefore things around you because of that. Like, not running around burning shit down, because it's not really.
Well, I mean, you might, like, honestly.
Well, yeah, if it gets bad enough, right?
At that point, if you truly slip into it, it's like this.
Well, yeah, why not go?
It's a contagion. Just like Russia. Like, you don't want to end up like Russia.
Yeah, they definitely have some form of that, like that hope. What?
Yeah, it's like the disease of despair, or whatever the one article called it.
Yeah, and that, like there's no way that does not have a very large impact on the society, just because that stuff, like, it truly does, like, cause psychological, like, it just drags everything down around you, and, you know, everybody's a part of a network, and that poison spreads, and that, you know, that's very destructive. And again, from what I saw from Xi, though, he was not addressing let it rot, so I really don't know how far that one has spread, or how. I feel like you just
don't even address it. Like, addressing it would be more of a problem.
Yeah,
like,
it might actually cause it to blow up a lot more on social media.
Like, calling out slackers is honestly a time-honored tradition.
Yeah, it's true. But yeah, I don't know. It seems like could be a bit of a problem there. All right. Well, we've been going for quite a while. Do you guys have any other thoughts or any other pieces that you want to put in here?
Oh, I guess, just like put a bit of a summary on it. It seems like
Oh,
clearly
sorry.
China.
Sorry. Before we put a summary on it, I do have one little last piece. Um, just kind of goes back to like the start of the podcast where we were talking about like, you see all those videos on YouTube of like, oh, China's about to collapse and all of that. Like obviously a lot of that, I think from like this discussion, it's pretty clear. It's like they're clearly not going to completely implode. But I think there was one really interesting piece I found that does support like China. Like there are some like corroborating pieces that the economy is like not doing well, and despite like China posting like what would be relatively okay official numbers like a little while ago, like just like a couple weeks ago or a week ago or something like that. Um, a memo from the CEO of Huawei leaked, and he basically said that companies going into straight survival mode, that they need to just make money where and when they can, even though they're posting like tons and tons of like they have really healthy cash flows, they're making tons of money. And so it is really interesting to see that like Huawei CEO is, and basically he was saying like this is not just like us related, this is this is a decade of problems coming up, and we need to go into full-blown survival mode in order to just make it through. Like we got a decade of chilling, I think is what he said. And like so just there are some other signs that kind of point to problems, not just the ones that we were discussing, but others like within, obviously Huawei is one of the most powerful companies in China. And if they're going into survival mode, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I guess my summary was going to be more or less in line with that. I think you have a lot of videos coming out that China collapse in 2 weeks or whatever in response to, I think it's the the opposite extreme of like the conventional wisdom for the last 20 years, right? And so it obviously is going to get a lot of attention. I think the conventional wisdom is not going to be entirely accurate, but China is obviously not likely to collapse. I mean, you have regimes that are much worse off in every metric that are going strong. And, you can look at the example of, say, Iran, which is less wealthy. Or like, I think one thing to consider too is like way worse technology. Like China's really loaded up on the oppression technology, I guess you'd call it. Like
CCTV and
Social credit
social
score.
credit score.
All that sort of stuff. So like, I think it is kind of like up to the CCP how they go about it. I think they can retain power if they want. Like it's kind of up to them, which is unfortunate because I think leaving things up to them has not been great. They've made some, I guess based on
genocidal choices.
Yeah, exactly. So it's unfortunate, but I think it's up to them. But the conventional wisdom that they're just gonna ride into the sunset as the number one economy, and they're gonna therefore liberalize, and they're it's all because the CCP is like some strategic mastermind. I think a lot of that has big flaws, and those flaws are going to lead to a breakdown of that narrative and some rocky road ahead of China, I think, regardless of what decisions the CCP makes. Like if they do try to save the economic situation, I think they will face some more political turmoil and some more political upheaval and speaking out, and Hong Kong protests amplified in the mainland, that kind of thing. And if they crank it all down and clamp down as hard as possible to prevent any of that from happening, I think you can't help but see the economy suffer for it pretty substantially. And
which could also lead to like more and more like
it could spiral for sure.
Yeah, upheaval, right? Like that, if the economic situation really gets out of control and they do sink into, a big, maybe not like a full-blown Great Depression or anything like that, but like, a pretty sizable recession that doesn't, have, a clear end in sight, like that could really cause some problems. But
again, I think it's really up to the CCP from where, you look at a place like North Korea, their economy is a lot worse than China's and they're still going strong, whatever, 70, 80 years in. And yeah, it's not all, like, there's obviously huge differences, but from what I can glean, I don't see the CCP losing control.
No, I don't.
Unless they make some terrible decisions or some truly unexpected events happen, which is always possible. Obviously, right? It's hard to predict it's hard to predict the future, but I think the most likely scenario, the two likely scenarios is they clamp down and turn into a kind of more stagnant, stale economy that doesn't actually, rocket to the moon, but they keep their stranglehold, as strong or stronger than it is now, or they do kind of, find a path to a bit being more open and loosening the controls and continuing that growth. But I don't think that's going to happen under Xi, and so that might be a longer range scenario.
Yeah, like
unless Xi dies of super COVID,
dies of polonium, or dies of falling out of a hospital window.
I think the thing with China that's always has to be remembered is that there's almost nowhere there is nowhere that's as important, that's behind such a veil of uncertainty to even themselves, let alone anyone trying to look from the outside in. Like that country is an enigma. So all we can do is try and garner some stuff from experts who are trying to read the tea leaves, as it were. And it certainly doesn't seem like any of the extravagant YouTube headlines are that justified, but at the same time, there's a world where any of those crazy things happen. It just might be a 1 in a million. And the reasons for that crazy thing happening probably aren't known to anybody, let alone even the Chinese, let alone us.
Yeah. I definitely think that's true. Like especially given like their own, like China's, like the incentive structure basically makes it so like impossible to determine whether or not you're dealing with anything real there. So like, how do you really get shit, or how do you predict things and make rational long-term choices when everything is just kind of, so like everything's just in a ton of river mud?
I think because this is the case with anything, but especially because of the vagueness with China, is really a platform for people to put their own framework of how they think the world works and say, like, China's like this because this is how I understand the world. And I pick and choose these facts and squeeze this and that, and look, it fits nicely.
Yeah. But
like, I even saw an article about how they didn't need to build more coal plants. Like, why were they building more coal plants? I'm like, how can you possibly even come to this conclusion when they're having like, this was written 2 years ago, and now they're having rolling blackouts despite having built those new coal plants. But somebody had somehow gotten to the point where they'd decided in their mind that China didn't need these new coal plants based on the weird perception of China they had. Their own unique China. Everybody has their own China in their heart.
What's your unique China price?
I've seen a hot take. I've just got a second. They're going to have a messiah figure, and they're going to have a big religious revolution become a theocracy.
It almost happened. The rest of the world will follow along because it was just clearly the number one. It's like, this is the Jesus. Like, all the other ones were clearly horseshit.
Oh, what was I can't remember the name of the revolt, but it was led by a guy who said he was the brother of Jesus. They almost took over Qing China.
maybe history will repeat itself
Yeah.
and takes over Xi's China. Anything else?
That's it for me.
All right.
Same.
Thanks for listening. Peace.
Peace.